Okay, we can. So we've had some feedback. We'll get going. Welcome everyone to this morning's webinar on standalone power systems, hosted by Energy Policy WA. My name's Jai Thomas. I'm joined by my Energy Policy WA colleagues, Catherine Barry, Amy Tate and Sasha Norton this morning. We've got a pretty packed hour, so we'll get into it very soon. Before we begin, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to recognise the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land that we are gathered here on today. It's a beautiful time of the year in the Noongar Nation. It is Julba, the season of conception, through August and September. It is a time of bursting yellow flowers, a time of Kulbadi, the magpie, starting to swoop, Wailish, the wedge-tailed eagle, starting to breed as the days start to warm up, and this rain eventually falls away. The Noongar people have a great connection to this land. And I find that the more I understand this connection, the more I'm guided in the work I do here each day. And so I think this is relevant about today's subject. And so with all that in mind, I'd like to acknowledge the Noongar people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So as I said, we've got a long story to tell this hour. Of course, we'd love to get questions along the way. We'll have Q&A at the end. This is a Microsoft Teams webinar, so I'm sure you've all used this platform before, but ultimately if you have a question to ask, put it in the Q&A field that should be in the corner of your screen. The questions will pop up. It'll be a voting contest for the most popular question. We'll do it that way. We'll start with the questions that are voted up, so hit the thumbs up screen on questions you see that you'd like answered first. Ideally we can get through all the questions, but if we cannot, we'll do it that way. We have Keely behind the scenes helping tick the slides over, so bear with us when we say next slide, Keely. That's just how this forum can best work. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Catherine Barry, our Director of Strategic and Consumer Policy here at Energy Policy WA, who's going to set the scene on all things SPS.
Great, thanks, Jai. First off, before we get into the main part of today's presentation, I'm going to provide some background and context, which some of you will already know, but if I could just provide to the next slide, please, Keely, that'd be great. So the WA SPS story. Over the past few years, Western Power and Horizon Power have demonstrated that in the right circumstances, standalone power systems are more cost-effective, safer and more reliable than traditional poles and wires. They're less prone to risks such as wind, rain, vegetation, lightning and bushfires. And this is obviously particularly relevant in regional and remote locations of the state where cost to supply electricity and customers are more likely to experience substandard power reliability. So back in 2016, Western Power installed 6 standalone power systems at farms in the towns of Ravensthorpe, West River, Lake King and Ongerup for an initial 12-month trial. The trial measured the reliability of power supply, customer experiences, the amount of solar generation and the impact on the grid. The results were overwhelmingly positive, and these customers continue to receive supply through SPSs today. Over the first 3 years since 2016, there was a total of 200 hours of avoided power outages for these customers, and 90% of power generated for the SPS came from solar, which was great. Since this time, Western Power has deployed an additional 52 standalone power systems as part of round 1 of its SPS program in the Great Southern, Midwest, Southwest and Wheatbelt regions. There are 98 units planned for delivery under round 2 of the rollout. As we've got on the slide there, 35 units were reprioritised from round 2 as part of the Cyclone Seroja response. Round 3 will see around 850 units rolled out, and Western Power has identified approximately 6,000 customers to be transitioned to SPS over the coming decades. Horizon Power has similarly been deploying SPS in its service area since around 2016. It has approximately 25 deployed in the Goldfields Esperance region, and as part of the state government's $66.3 million renewable energy technology stimulus package, Horizon received funding to deliver up to 50 SPS over the next 2 years in the Kimberley, Midwest, Goldfields, Esperance and Pilbara regions. Horizon Power has also identified that up to 1,000 of its customers are potential SPS candidates over the next decade. So there's a lot of opportunities for SPS, but we have a regulatory framework that was not designed with SPS in mind. So we can just go to the next slide, Keely. We'll just briefly go over that regulatory framework. So this slide, it's not the complete regulatory framework for energy, but it is highlights the key instruments that are of relevance to the work that we've been doing. So first up, there's the Electricity Industry Act, which governs the operation and regulation of the Western Australian electricity industry, and it, amongst other things, establishes the licensing framework, the third-party access framework, and the wholesale electricity market. Secondly, the Electricity Corporations Act, which provides for the establishment and operation of the 3 government trading corporations, Western Power, Horizon Power and Synergy. And thirdly, the Energy Operators Powers Act, which provides certain powers, such as in relation to land access for the energy operators. And the last box there is the Electricity Networks Access Code, which is established under the Electricity Industry Act and provides the framework for economic regulation and third-party access of covered transmission and distribution networks, and currently provides the framework for Western Power, regulation of Western Power's network in the Swiss. So this regulatory framework was initially developed in the early to mid-2000s and was based on a traditional structure of generators being connected to an extensive network of transmission and distribution lines that transport electricity to homes and businesses. So this framework did not support SPS, which are by definition not connected to a network. So what did we do? Keely, next slide please. So today we've been Energy Policy WA has been progressing reforms over recent years to address some regulatory barriers. So in 2020, the Electricity Industry Amendment Act passed Parliament, and it amended the 3 acts that I referred to on the slide previously. In terms of the Electricity Industry Act, it was amended to include new definitions and amend existing definitions to recognise SPS and allow for it to be deployed by a network operator who is regulated under the Access Code. The Electricity Corporations Act was amended to confirm that Western Power has a statutory function to provide SPS, and the Energy Operators Powers Act was amended to provide Western Power with the same power to access land that it has for the purposes of standalone power systems as it has for traditional poles and wires. Subsequent to that work, the Energy Transformation Task Force progressed changes to the Access Code for a number of matters, but also included changes to facilitate Western Power's use of standalone power systems and allow for the recovery of efficient expenditure associated with this technology through network tariffs. Lastly, with these main foundational reforms completed, Energy Policy WA commenced a detailed review of other regulatory instruments and policies to determine any gaps that we needed to address. This project was known as the SPS Policy and Regulation Project, with key aims to provide for SPS deployment with no unintended consequences, maintain appropriate customer protections and safety, and allow for the growth of the private sector and help future-proof the system. I'm now going to hand over to Amy Tate, who will provide more detail on this project.
Sorry. Thanks, Catherine. So as Catherine said, we undertook a comprehensive review of all the relevant regulatory instruments and policies to ensure that the adequate provision of SPS was enabled. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the process that we went through and some of the themes that we identified before we launch into the detail of the regulations. Keely, can you next slide, please? So this slide shows a lovely linear process of starting with the issues identification stage and then moving us through to a recommendations report to the Minister and commencement of regulatory drafting with the Parliamentary Council's office. So just to go to the issues identification piece, when we started this project, we really started just with a full brain dump of what are the questions we've been asked about SPS deployment, what are the questions we think we might be asked, what questions do we have or might be asked in the future, and we laid them all out, and then we figured out where they might sit in that regulatory framework that Catherine just spoke about earlier. Of course, the particular challenge with that piece of work was that we were looking for what wasn't there. So we needed to try and identify where gaps might be and where they needed to be filled, or where there might be barriers to the deployment of SPS that needed to be addressed. And then where we did identify a gap or a barrier, we kind of picked it up and examined it from a whole bunch of angles to see what the potential implications might be of addressing it or retaining the status quo, and what those implications might be for electricity consumers, for the private sector, for Western Power, for Horizon Power and Synergy where relevant. So there were lots of things that we had to look at whenever we discovered any potential gap in any of those potential pieces of regulatory instrument. So we did rely heavily on engagement throughout that process. Particularly like to thank Western Power and Horizon Power's team for their patience and assistance along the way. Most of the things that we put in place, of course, did have implications for them because of the regulatory framework that they work under. And so then what we did was we themed all of the issues, prioritised them, and then provided recommendations against each. That went up to the Minister in early this year, and which he approved. Next slide, please, Keely. So just to go back to the issues that we looked at, these were the sort of 5 themes where they ended up being grouped together. In the supply bucket, we considered issues relating to the supply from an SPS in an SPS context, such as how many customers does an SPS provide electricity to, what type of customers should an SPS provide electricity to, where Western Power should be able to provide them, and then who should get to decide when and where they're deployed. In the connection bucket, we looked at a whole range of issues connected to customer connection rights and costs that might be affected by the removal of poles and wires and the subsequent deployment of SPS. In the consumer bucket, we covered a whole range of issues around the deployment of SPS. As Catherine touched on, one of our key principles throughout this whole project was we wanted to make sure that SPS customers were not disadvantaged by receiving an SPS, and that they had parity of service and rights to their grid-connected counterparts. So we looked at the customer protection framework as it applied to SPS customers. We looked at PV integration, household solar issues. We looked at the cost of upgrading or augmenting an SPS and who should bear that cost. So a range of issues from the consumer angle that we looked at in this project. In the yellow box there, the compliance and reporting piece, really that was to explore the compliance and reporting framework and to make sure that it was still applicable in the context of an SPS. Of course, again, as Catherine alluded to, a lot of these things were written in the early to mid 2000s and haven't been upgraded since, so SPSs were not conceived in that context, so we wanted to make sure that we made any necessary changes to make sure that it was applicable. And then in the tariffs piece, we looked at an examination of the existing tariff structure as it relates to SPS. Next slide, please, Keely. So where we got to was all of that work culminated in a package of regulations which are now open for public comment until the end of August. We identified some areas where new regulations were required. We identified a bunch of regulations that needed amending, and we've also proposed some amendments to the NQRS code. Sasha's going to talk about the detail of all of this, but before she does, I just wanted to touch on that regulation that's in the middle column there at the top, the Electricity Corporations, Electricity Generation and Retail Corporation Area of Operation Amendment Regulations 2021. So that one isn't included in the consultation package because we had to pull that particular amendment out and fast track it. The reason that we did that is because as it stands, or as it stood, the Corporations Act limits the performance of Western Power's function to the Southwest Interconnected System, and it defines that system as the interconnected transmission and distribution system, generation works and associated works in the Southwest. So if we hadn't made any amendments to that, it meant that Western Power wasn't able to provide SPS that were not physically connected to the poles and wires of their network infrastructure. Obviously, the point of SPS is that it isn't physically connected to that, and it can be an islanded system. So we amended those regulations to enable Western Power to provide SPS in its distribution license area, and for those SPS to be physically disconnected from the grid. We had to fast track that so as to enable the continued rollout of Western Power's SPS program without having the weird consequence of them having to connect them to the grid. Next slide, please, Keely. So it was front of mind for us on this project that we were operating in a space of rapid technological change. We were also operating in a space of extensive market adjustments and reform across the electricity sector more completely. So we knew that we had to be sufficiently flexible with what we put in place to accommodate all of those fast-moving changes in our sector. But we also needed to build in regulatory certainty for these GTEs in particular. So as a consequence of walking that fine line, there were some issues that we have not addressed in this package of regulation, but we are keeping a watching brief on, and we are fully aware that we might have to come back to them in the future. In the supply category, that relates to large loads. So the government made it very clear in its explanatory memorandum to the Amendment Act that Western Power is not to provide large isolated loads such as mining operations with SPS. It's not to use SPS for new lines of business. Whether and to what extent we need to formalise that further is something that we're still considering. In the consumer area, with customer protections, we spend a lot of time, as I said, looking at the customer protection framework. For now, we found that all of the existing protections for grid-connected customers translated to SPS customers, so no changes were required for where those SPSs are provided by Horizon Power and Western Power. We've just got this up here to acknowledge that in the future, as we get more SPSs out there in the world, and as the private sector SPSs perhaps grow in number, that we will continue to revisit the customer protection framework to make sure it's fit for purpose. PV integration, solar PV is the subject of technical trials at the moment. So how a householder can potentially self-consume their own PV to reduce their bills in the same way that we can here in the metro area is still something that's being looked at. So we'll continue to work with Western Power and Horizon Power on whether there's any policy arrangements required there. In compliance and reporting, we did discover that there needed to be some amendments made to the network safety regulations. Those regulations sit under the Minister for Commerce, so they weren't exactly in our in our area, but amendments are being drafted at the moment, and demos have carriage for that to make sure that they apply to SPS. And finally, the tariffs we've left alone for now. The existing uniform tariff structure will continue for SPS customers, but again, like customer protections, it's something we will keep an eye on, acknowledging that as SPSs grow in number, there may be adjustments that will need to be made. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Sasha here, who's going to take you on a deep exploratory journey of the regulatory amendments.
Thanks, Amy. Morning, everyone. I'll try and make this as engaging as possible. So over the next few slides, I'm going to take you through, as Amy said, the detail of 3 issues. The prescribed number of customers that an SPS can serve, customer engagement provisions for SPS customers, the obligation to connect, provisions in terms of a customer's right to connect, and the cost that a customer can expect to pay for that connection. Thanks, Keely. Next slide. So the first set of regulations are the Electricity Industry Standalone Power Systems Regulations 2021. These are new regulations and relate to the number of customers that an SPS can legally serve. Thanks, Keely. So the definition of an SPS inserted into the Electricity Industry Act refers to the supply of electricity to a single customer or not more than a prescribed number of customers. So in the absence of regulations to prescribe the number of customers, it limits an SPS deployed by Western Power to supply a single customer. So that means an SPS can serve multiple connection points, for example, a primary residence, a sharing shed, a dam, or an electric fence, all within a single property boundary. But what it does not do is enable that customer to then subdivide their land or to create 2 separate customer accounts for its supply. And while we acknowledge that SPS supply to a single customer is probably the most common deployment scenario for Western Power, SPS is still relatively new, and to allow some flexibility for different customer locations and configurations, we felt that the most appropriate number of customers at a single SPS deployed by Western Power at present should be 5. Thanks, Keely. The second set of amending regulations, the Electricity Industry Regulations Amendment Standalone Power Systems Regulations 2021, that means yours, yeah. amends 2 sets of existing regulations. These are the Electricity Industry License Conditions Regs and the Electricity Industry Obligation to Connect Regulations. So I'll talk through these amendments in relation to customer engagement and the obligation to connect. Thanks, Keely. So amendments to the energy legislation include, as Catherine mentioned earlier, an explicit statutory function under the Electricity Corporations Act, which confirms Western Power's ability to provide SPS in a like manner to existing. So prior to these amendments in 2020, customers could technically opt in to receive an SPS and essentially had a choice as to whether they received electricity supply through an SPS or a grid connection. But the confirmation of this statutory function means that Western Power's rollout at that point transitioned from an explicit consent model to what we refer to as an automatic rollout. This essentially means that a customer no longer has the option to receive a poles and wires connection if an SPS has been deemed the most cost-effective or most suitable supply solution. In addition, Western Power also has the authority to remove de-energised poles and wires once an SPS has been installed. So given that Western Power is no longer required to obtain this explicit consent, we've proposed amendments to the licence conditions regulations that will require both Western Power and Horizon Power to develop an engagement strategy for the Minister's approval, which will be made available on their respective websites and reviewed at least every 2 years. We've said that the strategy at a minimum should include things like protocols for engagement, information for customers and potential customers in relation to basic specifications of an SPS, the process of installation, customers' obligations in relation to having an SPS, indicative costs for upgrading or augmenting an SPS, and some general customer fault lines and details for the electricity ombudsman. Thanks, Keely. So next I'll talk through the obligation to connect provisions in an SPS context. So under the existing electricity industry obligation to connect regs, distributors must connect a customer's premises to a distribution system if it's within 100 metres of it. So a distributor may charge the customer the amount that it would cost to make the connection. So in simple terms, under these regs, it gives customers whose premises are within 100 metres of a network the right to request a connection and get a quote, and then receive that connection if they're willing to pay. So if no amendments are made to these regulations, it would mean that when poles and wires are removed and replaced with an SPS, the distributor will have an obligation to connect a new customer if it's located within 100 metres of an SPS. So all customers that were located along the distribution system, which has now been removed, no longer are covered by the regulations. Next slide, thanks, Keely. So this is probably a little bit easier to understand through this infographic. So the solid blue line represents the distribution system that's in situ. The dotted blue line represents the poles and wires that have been removed. The triangle is the SPS, and the green shaded area is the obligation to connect zone. So as you can see, once we remove poles and wires, if nothing's done to the regulations, then there is no obligation for the distributor to connect anybody in that zone any longer. So next slide, thanks, Keely. So to address this issue and to ensure that no customer was disadvantaged by the SPS rollout, the proposed amendments include a 10-year grandfathering provision over the removed poles and wires. So that's depicted by the orange shaded area. We considered that this was an appropriate time frame to allow those customers an opportunity to transition to new arrangements. So it's important to note that that sort of orange shaded area just represents the right for a customer to connect. It doesn't actually grandfather the cost of that connection. Thanks, Keely. Which brings us to the potential impact on the cost of connection for customers who were previously within the 100 metres of the distribution system. So while there's no one size fits all, and there's no guarantee of a low cost grid connection, it's reasonable to assume that if you're a customer that's located within 100 metres of poles and wires, you're within 25 kilometres of a subzone station, and where the terrain is fairly easy for Western Power or Horizon Power to navigate, you could generally assume under this scenario that a customer would expect to pay less for a poles and wires connection than they would for a new SPS. However, once the poles and wires are removed, customers who retain the right to connect will have to pay the full cost of an SPS, which is around the $200,000 mark. The primary issue arises when a customer is obviously required to pay more for an SPS than they would have otherwise had if the network hadn't been removed. So these proposed amendments to the obligation to connect regs also provide a grandfathering provision that provides a customer the option to receive an SPS at a network equivalent cost, or the cost of an SPS, whichever is cheaper, for a period of 2 years from when the distributor, Horizon Power or Western Power, notifies the customer that it intends to remove poles and wires. And this is obviously just to ensure that regional customers are not disadvantaged by the rollout. Thanks, Keely. Next slide. So, as you can see on the infographic, the amendments grandfather the customer's right to connect for 10 years, which is the light orange shaded area, and they grandfather the cost of that connection for 2 years from the customer being notified of the intention of the poles and wires to be removed. So that's the red dotted line. And it's probably just worth clarifying that these scenarios only apply to new customer connections, so and not to customers who've been identified as under the SPS rollout program. Of course, those customers receive the SPS at no cost in lieu of Horizon Power or Western Power replacing any aging poles and wires infrastructure. So I'll hand back to Amy now to go through some more policy and regulatory amendments.
Thanks, Ash. So just a few more to touch on. Next slide, please, Keely. they are less complex than the obligation to connect. That was probably the curliest policy issue that we stumbled upon. Next slide, please, Keely. So there are 4 additional ones that you'll see if you hop onto our website and visit the package of reg changes that we put forward. One is around the method of supply. So in the obligation to connect regulations, we've made it clear that the obligation to connect includes connection through a network connection or an SPS, and that it's up to the distributor to determine what the most suitable connection option is, not the customer. So it gives that, hands that decision to the distributor so they can make that decision in the best interest of the network and the broader customer base. The augmentation costs are around, I guess, picking up the current situation for grid-connected customers, where if a customer wants to increase their load, then they can do that if they're willing to pay for changes or upgrades to the network that serves them. So we lifted that principle and placed it on the SPS context, so an SPS customer can upgrade their SPS if they want to, and if they're able to pay for that. The time frames was just to, the time frames was again amendments in the obligation to connect regulations, which set out the time frame for distributor to comply with the obligation to connect if they're providing electricity via an SPS. Without changes, those regulations would have dictated that they had to attach or connect an SPS within 20 business days. But in most cases, that 20 business day timeframe isn't practicable for an SPS, given the groundwork and consultation that needs to take place. So a revised timeframe of 4 months for SPS has been proposed, as well as the option to agree to a later time with the customer. And the notification requirements speak to Sasha's earlier point around the obligation to connect. We've now embedded an obligation on distributors to notify customers that the poles and wires are going to be decommissioned. So that's poles and wires that are serving a customer, but also notification of the customers within that 100-metre obligation to connect zone that they need to be notified as well, so that they can activate the price capping grandfathering should they wish to in that 2-year period. Next slide, please, Gilly. So the final one that we need to talk about is quality and reliability reporting. Next slide, please, Gilly. So the Network Quality and Reliability of Supply Code, which from here on in I'll call the NQRS code, specifies the quality and reliability standards that distributors are required to comply with. They haven't been changed since the code was first introduced in 2005, so of course they don't contemplate SPS. We believed in our project team that it was important to have visibility over the performance of SPS, particularly as a new technology, to ensure that customers are receiving an appropriate level of service and to provide transparency across the distribution network. So the code currently requires distributors to report on network performance within set geographical areas of the state. It covers Perth CBD, urban areas other than Perth CBD, and any other area of the state. So based on the current code, the SPS would most likely be aggregated into that any other area of the state bucket, and all of the requirements and data would be aggregated with the network that's in that area as well. So the amendments that we've proposed ensure that, first of all, they ensure that the definition of network in the NQRS code explicitly includes SPS, and that SPS is considered in its own right and included as a separate reporting category under the code. And so that way, into the future, we'll be able to compare SPS performance as a new technology and compare it with network performance in similar areas. Next slide, please, Gilly. So that brings us to the end of the detail on the proposed amendments. In terms of the next steps from here, as I mentioned, they're open for public comment until the 27th of August, and we would really like to hear back from industry and agencies on that. We will then review any submissions that we get and make any amendments that are necessary as a consequence of those submissions, and then ultimately we'll then move it through the government regulatory approvals process, leading to a final gazettal party at some stage, hopefully later this year. Next stage, please, Kelly. Over to you, Johnny.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for the detailed walkthrough on all things SPS. As we framed up from the beginning, the big believers in standalone power systems. We have a few people listening in from the East Coast. I think this gives a flavour of once you get to that big decision of is an SPS a better alternative to network supply, there's still a lot of detail to work through in how you make it fit within the existing regulatory framework and ensure that all of the right customer protections and settings apply. And that's the huge volume of work that Catherine, Sasha and Amy have done that is ultimately culminating in this consultation on regulations at the moment. So we'll now move to Q&A. We've had a number of questions published, and encourage you to vote them up. And I'll just kind of walk through them, hand them over to Amy, Catherine and Sasha as necessary. So Catherine, I'll get you just to scroll up to the top and we'll take it from the top. Bit of trouble with the mouse, but I guess I'll start with the first one I can see then. So we've got a question here from Anonymous that states, given an ongoing cost, existing network versus capital cost for a new SPS, how is it possible that a new SPS is cheaper than an existing network connection? I guess this is a function of, we're in this regime, we're in this process of, I guess, progressing SPS based on the fact that there is a significant proportion of the existing network that's due for replacement. And so ultimately, this is a function of the cost of replacing that aging infrastructure with the alternate cost of servicing a consumer with an SPS. So, you know, all the SPSs installed to date, as well as the forecast 1,000 odd over the next 4 years, really pass that threshold test of, is this in the long term for consumers? And Western Power and Horizon both need to consider a lot in making that determination, the cost of replacing standalone power system kit as it ages, as well as consider the revenue that they'll receive from customers by paying their electricity bills. So that test isn't just a once-off upfront capital cost test, it's a 50-year test that really assesses, is this single customer or this section of line worth replacing relative to the cost of replacing those connection points with SPSs. And so that's really the test, and it, increasingly, particularly as standalone power systems costs come down, that test will increasingly be further realised. It also is applicable when we have a storm or a bushfire, and there is that same example of network needing to be replaced. So ultimately that test then applies. So the number looking forward is about 1,000 over the next 4 years, but of course in the event of a bushfire or cyclone like Cyclone Seroja, Western Power and Horizon will apply that same test. So that's the first question. Catherine's having a lot of trouble with the mouse, but okay, next question for Patrick Peake. Can customers, and Amy did touch on this, but can customers still install their own solar on their house shed with their level of payments to Western Power and Horizon then fall, and will Western Power face extra losses due to reduced income? So I'll let Amy talk in a sec about the technical challenge with that. From a first principles perspective, when it comes to customers not being worse off by having an SPS, then you know the principle should apply that they should be able to do what other customers that are network connected are able to do and sort of reduce their own costs. So it's certainly a principle that should apply. I guess the question is it then technically feasible to have a PV system on one side of a meter, grid exporting into a standalone power system on the other side of the meter, on the network side of the meter, and does that all work? I think, Amy, you've touched on it, that's the subject of trials. Do you want to further elaborate?
Yeah, no, there's not much more to add. Those technical trials are underway so far. It's looking like Western Power is going to be able to find a technical solve for that. Actually, much less solar PV out in the regions than there is in areas, so it hasn't been an enormous thing that Western Power have had to face with the SPSs that they've deployed so far. But as Jai said, we do want that fundamental principle of that the customers should be able to reduce their bill connected customers can.
So I'd suggest, Patrick, where we would end up at a minimum is that it may be a zero net export scenario, but should there be a technical solution that makes it work, then there's no reason they wouldn't be able to receive the debt the customers receive. Your question about the drop in Western Power's revenue, well, ultimately, standalone power systems are recovered broadly from the tariff base. Again, that threshold test of whether this is a cheaper and more efficient alternative to replacing poles and wires still applies. So ultimately, by receiving the SPS, the tariff base broadly is having downwards pressure on network costs through an SPS rollout. So we'll move on to the next question. There's a heap of questions flooding in, so keep voting them up, and then also, actually, Catherine, you can sort by most popular, not most recent. Yeah, that'd be great. The next question that I can see: what was the reason for? Oh, it's just disappeared.
It was what was the reason for making the customer engagement strategy a license condition rather than just getting the minister to tell them to do it. Really, the decision was we did consider that option, ministerial instruction, but the purpose of this project was to embed some of these things long into the future rather than rely on ministerial orders for things. That one was deemed to be quite important because of the nature of the new technology and because of the fairly complex policy around the grandfathering. So we wanted to embed that more formally into the license arrangements.
Thanks, Amy. Okay, next question is slide up to the top. Oh, I'll just cover up on that one. Will this presentation be made available? Yes is the answer. Catherine already wrote that there. Will zero PV export be the new standard for customers connected to an SPS? I think that's the subject of the technical trial that's happening at the moment, and so we'll see the outcome of that. But again, that principle of customers not being worse off should apply. Catherine, because this sorts in reverse order, I'll get you to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and maybe you can use the scroll pad on the mouse.
I'll just take that one about reliability measures applying to SPS. I think that question is sort of, it's one thing to report on performance of SPS, but what should the reliability requirements be on that? At this stage, because the number of SPSs is quite few out there, and because it's still early technology, we didn't want to put reliability standards in place yet. We want to be able to look at their performance, we want to be able to assess their performance, but service standard benchmarks and things are covered off in the Western Power's access arrangement, and the ERA and Western Power will work some of those up specific to SPS, we assume at some point in the future.
Thanks, Amy. Next question there. Could you clarify if someone needed a new SPS connection, a new connection after 2 years, they would need to purchase an SPS for whatever the applicable price is, 200K is listed there, which would be owned and operated by the utility. But wouldn't they be better off to just purchase their own private SPS for a lot less? I guess the question there is, would they ultimately be better off entering the regulated supply regime or going it alone? And that's really a question that any landowner faces right now, in terms of should they connect to the network however far away it is, or should they go through a self-supply arrangement. The grandfathering seeks to preserve some rights that customers have for what we think is an appropriate period of time where they're close to an existing piece of network, but after 2 years those rights will fall away and customers will have that same test. They may wish to pay the, I guess, the capital contribution required to enter the regulated supply regime. What would happen there is they'll continue to pay their bill, but ultimately their supply will continue year after year, and if an SPS kit needs to be replaced, then that's dealt with within the regime and all of those customer protections apply. Alternately, they could choose to purchase a private SPS, pay no bills, but essentially continue to receive a supply that they're solely responsible for. So there's pros and cons, and ultimately the customer has to think about those at the time of deciding how to get to their property. Okay, next question there from Alex. Often the latent network capacity far exceeds the customer consumption level. If the SPS has been specifically tailored for an individual customer consumption, those customers be disadvantaged if required to pay for an SPS augmentation when previously their connection would have easily handled this demand? Amy, do you have a
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's definitely one that we visited a number of times. I'm going to point to the customer engagement strategy for that, because there's so much dependent on Western Power and Horizon Power's engagement with the customer about what their load is going to be, and then to spec up the SPS according to that. And at that point, their predicted future electricity needs, and build that in. Now, we know that's not an exact science, and there will be changes along the way, but it's one of the reasons we've built in a customer engagement strategy, so that those have.
My expectation would be that a customer would receive essentially an equivalent supply to the network. That would the network supply is calculated as an after diversity maximum demand calculation, and so any cost to augment an SPS wouldn't kick in until a customer is essentially exceeding a network after diversity maximum demand type calculation. So I think that largely explains the question, unless you've got anything else to add.
Yeah.
Okay, Anonymous asks, are the 5 connections per SPS all required on one lot?
No. So that having the 5 connections means that you could have 5 different customers, all located on farms that were on different property boundaries.
I think this really just points to the threshold test again of what's the better solution when you're considering a number of connection points at the end of a long stringy line or along a long stringy line, and how do you optimise the most efficient outcome for all customers by giving flexibility to the network to, I guess, scope up alternative solutions. So you might have 2 customers at the end of a line, and they're quite close together, and it makes much more sense to have an SPS somewhere between their 2 connection points that services both of them, rather than 2 individual SPSs. So we're empowering Western Power to really provide the right solution under the right circumstance for the benefit of those customers that are receiving the SPS, but also for the benefit of all consumers who ultimately will pay for this through network tariffs. Next question from Anonymous is, has Epworth considered how this may affect land values and development in regional areas? I think overwhelmingly the provision of standalone power systems is about taking customer supply forward, not backwards, and that really comes through in their improved reliability. We all know the stat that 50-odd% of Western Power's network is servicing 3% of the customer base. Western Power has an incentive-based performance regime, but the worst performing feeders and the worst performing customers will still have pretty poor reliability outcomes, and that's well documented. Trial outcomes that we've seen to date. So taking customers forward in their electricity supply by giving them a reliable supply, reducing bushfire risk and other risk associated with poles and wires, whilst having all of those grandfathering arrangements to preserve existing rights for a pragmatic period of time, we think is a really good solution in the regions, rather than, say, reduce land values or opportunity for regional development. The next question, unless anyone's got anything to add? No? Next question is from Anonymous again. Given an ongoing cost, existing network versus capital cost for new SPS, we did cover that as the first question, so KB.
Just while we find another one, just while we're finding another question there about why aren't we allowing private sector SPSs now? I just want to cover that off to say there is nothing in any of this that precludes the private sector from offering to use a private provider to serve their electricity. This is all about the regulatory framework that sits over Western Power and to a certain extent Horizon Power.
Yeah, I guess just to take that further, ultimately these customers that are receiving a network supply at the moment are effectively serviced within the regulatory regime, and so ultimately we need to continue on with a service arrangement for those customers and Western Power is best placed to continue to service those customers, but ultimately determine how that solution is provided. And they'll always have to go to market to purchase SPS. Participation one way or another. Moving on to the next question, I think we've covered that. If you can just scroll up, KB. Roy Mitchell asked how current design of SPS cater for increased electricity demand from customers such as electric vehicle charging.
Well, I guess that goes to the earlier question about what if somebody needs to upgrade their SPS. But if I've got anything else to
Sure.
add.
And I would point out that, you know, catering for electric vehicle charging on the network is going to be a significant challenge going forward as well. So it's not really a situation that's solely unique to SPSs. The next question is how are the systems sizing for customer decided? Do you record customers loading? Cover that to some extent.
Sorry, can I just go back to that question? The augmentation costs.
How are the system size ultimately decided? So Western Power engages with the customer.
Yep, yeah, exactly. And I think that just to go back to the EV charging scenario, if you thought that you were going to be getting an electric vehicle and you were due to receive an SPS, the engagement process with Western Power would look to the future and say, look, have you got, you know, some business activity that might happen in the next couple of years? Will you be getting an electric vehicle that might need charging? So all of those discussions will happen, and there'll be some sort of future proofing of the size of the SPS that you will get, obviously provided that you can sort of evidence some of these activities that'll be happening, so that Western Power isn't just supplying a massive SPS where it's not required, but certainly customer demand is taken into the customer engagement process at the outset.
Okay, next question from Matt. Do customers receive a cost benefit for the physical land lost to incorporate the Saps compared to the power lines? They are bigger. I think that's a fantastic question that we've really engaged, Western Power and Horizon really engaged with customers through the trials and found that ultimately customers have had an overwhelming preference for having an SPS located on their property rather than poles and wires across the landscape. And I'd suggest that the corridors required around poles and wires in aggregate are much greater in terms of footprint than the SPS footprint, recognising the majority of customers that an SPS applies for larger landowners on the fringe of the grid, and typically there's plenty of space on their property to have a small standalone power system producing electrons. But you know, the anecdotal feedback is it's great from a farming perspective. You don't have to worry about driving your tractor and hitting your poles and wires and all that sort of thing. So ultimately, I think this is a much better outcome from a land use perspective, including that reduced risk of bushfire and other consequences of having poles and wires spread across the landscape. So there's no cost benefit assessment attached to that. We just think that's a better place to be for these customers. I think we've answered David Butler's question there. Ben Hessel asked, with a consumer supplier via an SPS, do they have all energy retailed directly to the distribution company? If so, are there restrictions, i.e. less than the current bill? The simple answer to that question is that their retail arrangement remains unchanged. So we have in Western Australia a regulated retail arrangement with a monopoly supply for customers under a threshold. We looked, as Amy said, at tariff structures and what should apply, but ultimately under the principle of not wanting to, I guess, make any SPS customer worse off for having received it, we opted at this stage to just leave the current regulated retail tariff arrangement in place. In future, you know, that may change as tariff structures evolve, and it might be worthwhile pursuing alternative tariff structures to really incentivise, you know, the best outcome from an efficient SPS supply perspective. But in an environment where it's not an opt-in from the consumer, you certainly want to have them in the right, I guess, customer protection space up front. Anything to add to that, Amy? No. Roy Mitchell asked, does the policy allow for alternate energy generation than PV, also alternate storage versus battery storage?
Conveniently, I have the definition of an SPS right here in front of me. That definition was made in the Electricity Industry Act, and it's defined as wires, apparatus, equipment, plant or buildings, including generating works, a distribution system and any storage works, which together are used or to be used for or in connection with or to control the supply of electricity to a prescribed number of customers. So it doesn't specify the technology, it specifies the arrangement of that technology.
Excellent, thanks Amy. Anonymous asked there, will there still be an option to upgrade from singles or split phase to 3-phase? I think we've covered that off under the augmentation opportunity that customers have, and our desire to see that essentially mirror what happens on the distribution network at present. The next question is on EPWA's work on behind the meter code of practice, and will it have a bearing on the SPS regulatory framework being implemented? So I think it will have a bearing on the SPS regulatory framework for consumers who ultimately choose to take up their own SPS or purchase an SPS from the private sector. Ultimately, the behind the meter code will likely cover off on those types of arrangements and the sort of consumer protections that need to apply for activities outside of the network regulatory framework, which those would be. But I don't think at this stage there's any reason to think that alternative energy services framework will particularly impact the regulated supply of SPSs from Horizon Power or Western Power. Guys, session.
Yep, that's spot on. Yep.
Okay, 200k per system seems expensive when compared to what is on the market. I think that's just a random number, but ultimately Western Power will need to go through at every step of their and Horizon 2, but Western Power, as regulated by the ERA, will need to go through essentially a procurement process to purchase the most efficient supply solution over the 50-year time frame that they're essentially assessing these solutions on. That's regulated by the ERA. The ERA has almost unlimited powers to dive into these procurement processes and assess what was efficient or not. And so ultimately we think that the existing regulatory process for determining efficient investment by Western Power will be fit for purpose for the SPS regime. All right, last question, or I think we're done. Does the estimated 200k price tag include delivery and install costs of the current design SPS? I guess from a new connection perspective, subsequent to the grandfathering period lapsing, then ultimately the capital contribution that a customer pays would be the full connection cost required to service their premises. So in the same way you pay for the network reticulation to be delivered to your house, including installation of poles and wires, you would expect that the price tag for receiving the SPS post that grandfathering period would cover all costs required to electrify your premise and have you enter the regulated supply regime, and then from there on you are essentially regulated through network tariffs and would pay your contribution to network upkeep through your retail bill. Next question, we'll do it. We've got a little bit of time left. If there is a fault on the SPS, does this utility come out and fix them, or is this the private sector? Ultimately, that's a question for the utility to determine, and they have obligations to make sure that supply is rectified in a timely manner, and increasingly we'll look to not only reporting on performance of SPS, but also whether there are any reliability standards that should apply. As noted, we would expect reliability to be extremely high, but from time to time there'll be a fault, and we would expect that ultimately the utility will have to find the most efficient way to restore that fault, whether that's in certain circumstances subcontracting out those arrangements or doing it with their own crew. That's very much a question for Western Power and the consideration of where their depots are, but also the capability of their current and future workforce. I'm sure you've got anything to add to that, Teeny? Okay, we'll keep going while the questions are coming, because I think we've got till 11:30ish. 11:15. So Ben asks, if a consumer is highlighted for an SPS system and they don't have suitable land available on their property, can the SPS system be installed on the neighbour's property, and how is this handled? I think that's a fantastic question and highlights really the depth and breadth that Western Power go to at present, but also will define in their customer engagement strategy on just how they engage almost at an individual level with these customers and design up solutions that are fit for purpose. Ultimately, they have a vested interest in making sure the land access and land suitability arrangements are as good as they can be. If there are shading issues, if there are issues in the terrain, those things they will need to sort out up front and have an interest in getting right. So I think this will naturally be resolvable, and that's why we have such things as the up to 5 SPSs, up to 5 customers on a single SPS option for Western Power, because we want that flexibility for the right solution to be provided in the right circumstance. Anything to add, Amy?
No.
Who will be maintaining all the SPSs? Will Western Power linesmen be retrained? I think it's an excellent question, and one we'll probably have to defer to Western Power, who are obviously actively looking at their current and future workforce capability and needs, as well as engaging with training providers, TAFEs, etc., on what that future workforce will look like. So I think that's a live question, but it's a live question in the context of the energy transformation that we are on more broadly, including the high DER penetration on the poles and wires network as well. So fantastic question, and I think that's largely being covered off in Western Power's workforce planning. Okay, I think that's all the questions. There's been heaps, and I certainly appreciate the depth and breadth of them. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning. I think we had about 70 attendees, so thank you for taking time out of your day to truly understand the deep detail of the SPS regulatory framework and really how we've evolved what was a regulatory framework designed for one-way flow across poles and wires to something that is embracing new technology and innovating for the benefit of regional consumers, but consumers as a whole in terms of new supply solutions. So I'd like to thank Catherine, Barry, Amy Tate and Sasha Norton from Energy Policy WA for answering all your questions and taking us through the detail. We do have a few more questions there, but we will just park it for now. I'm happy to answer those at a later stage. So thanks everyone for attending this morning, and have a great rest of your day.